Welcome to Omni View, episode 103. It's July 5th, 2026, and as always, we're covering what happened from every angle. Today's stories, multiple viewpoints, your call. Trump's offer to mediate the Ukraine war in a 90-minute call with Putin raises the prospect of renewed high-level diplomacy just before a NATO summit. U.S. President Donald Trump spoke by phone with Russian President Vladimir Putin for nearly 90 minutes and offered to help find solutions to the Ukraine conflict. The Kremlin described the exchange as businesslike and constructive, while noting Moscow's accusations of Ukrainian terrorism tied to recent drone strikes on Russian energy sites. The call occurred ahead of a NATO summit scheduled for July 7 to 8 in Turkey. Russian officials maintain that direct leader engagement bypasses entrenched positions in Kiev and allows pragmatic trade-offs on security guarantees and regional control, a mechanism that ended earlier frozen conflicts when great power interests aligned. Ukrainian and NATO-aligned voices counter that any deal omitting full territorial restoration would legitimize force as a tool for border changes, undermining the post-1945 norm that has preserved European stability. Both sides accept that battlefield realities and alliance cohesion will determine whether talks advance. What specific security assurances would each side require before any formal talks begin? Shifting now to developments in U.S.-China relations. China freed a pastor from a prominent underground church weeks after President Trump personally raised the detention during a meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. The pastor had been held since October, and his family described the release as a hopeful development for religious freedom advocates. Chinese authorities presented the decision as an internal legal matter resolved through normal procedures. U.S. officials highlighted the outcome as evidence that direct leader-to-leader communication can produce concrete results on individual cases. Religious freedom organizations welcomed the move while noting that broader restrictions on unregistered churches remain in place. U.S. advocates maintain that raising specific cases at the highest level creates accountability and can secure releases that lower-level diplomacy cannot achieve, preserving leverage without broader confrontation. Chinese officials contend that such interventions represent external pressure on sovereign judicial processes and that releases occur only when domestic legal standards are met. Both acknowledge that the timing followed the Trump-Xi discussion. How do Chinese authorities typically respond to foreign leader interventions on individual detentions? Next, we turn to energy markets. OPEC Plus reached a preliminary agreement to raise oil production quotas by approximately 188,000 barrels per day for August. Delegates indicated the step could allow additional supply to reach markets if current conditions hold. Gulf producers supported the measured increase as a way to balance revenue needs with market stability. Consumer countries have generally welcomed signals of reliable supply. Industry analysts noted that any sustained rise depends on whether geopolitical tensions ease further. Member states argue that gradual quota adjustments prevent price spikes that harm both producers and consumers while maintaining the group's ability to respond to demand shifts. Importing nations and independent analysts counter that coordinated supply management can delay necessary market corrections and keep prices artificially elevated. Both recognize that actual flows will depend on compliance and external events. How do quota decisions translate into actual production changes? Meanwhile, tax policy changes are under discussion in the United Kingdom. Andy Burnham's plans would reduce the threshold for an additional levy on high-value homes to £1.5 million, potentially affecting more than 150,000 families with four-figure tax increases. The proposal is still weeks from implementation. Supporters describe the change as a necessary step to broaden the tax base and fund public services without raising rates on lower-value properties. Critics argue it would impose new burdens on middle-class homeowners in high-cost areas and risk slowing housing market activity. Proponents maintain that adjusting thresholds captures revenue from properties that have seen substantial appreciation and aligns tax policy with current asset values. Opponents contend that such levies can discourage investment in housing stock and create arbitrary cliffs that penalize owners who have not realized gains. Both agree the policy would expand the number of properties subject to the higher rate. How would local authorities administer the revised threshold? Turning to developments in the Middle East, Iran's envoy to China stated that vessels from friendly nations would receive special treatment when transiting the Strait of Hormuz, despite U.S. objections to new fees. The announcement concerns a key global oil shipping route. Iranian officials presented the policy as a sovereign right to manage passage through waters near its coastline. Countries reliant on the strait for energy imports expressed concern about potential added costs or delays. Shipping analysts noted that any differentiation among nations could complicate standard transit procedures. Iranian authorities argue that states maintaining positive relations should benefit from streamlined arrangements reflecting standard practice in managing strategic waterways. Maritime and energy security experts counter that selective fees risk fragmenting international shipping norms and inviting reciprocal restrictions elsewhere. Both accept that the strait remains a critical choke point for global energy flows. What specific fees or procedures are being considered? A historical document offers new perspective on 18th century Britain. A recently rediscovered parish entry from Manchester Cathedral records details of black residents in late 18th century England during the city's first major abolitionist meeting. Historians say the document provides rare insight into a community estimated at around 20,000 people nationwide at the time. Researchers view the record as valuable primary evidence that expands understanding of black presence and activism in northern England. Local historians emphasize its connection to the sermon by abolitionist Thomas Clarkson. Archivists note that such entries help correct gaps in official narratives of the period. Historians argue that individual parish documents like this one supply granular evidence of everyday life that aggregate statistics cannot capture, strengthening the factual basis for studies of Georgian-era diversity. Some archivists caution that single records must be interpreted alongside broader demographic and legal contexts to avoid overgeneralization. Both recognize the document's rarity. What other surviving records document black communities in 18th century Britain? New Hampshire Governor Kelly Ayotte highlighted the Pine Tree Riots as an earlier colonial protest that may have influenced the more famous Boston event. The riots involved resistance to British restrictions on timber resources. State officials present the riots as an important local chapter in the lead-up to independence that deserves wider recognition. Historians of the Revolutionary era note connections between resource disputes and growing colonial grievances. Some accounts suggest the events helped shape protest tactics used later in Massachusetts. Local historians maintain that recognizing earlier actions in New Hampshire provides a fuller timeline of resistance and shows how economic grievances spread across colonies. National scholars sometimes emphasize the Boston Tea Party's larger symbolic role while acknowledging preceding incidents. A new study produced the first comprehensive global map of mycorrhizal fungal networks that connect plant roots and influence carbon storage and nutrient cycling. Researchers say the map covers ecosystems on multiple continents. Scientists describe the work as a foundational dataset for understanding soil health and climate regulation. Ecologists note potential applications in agriculture and conservation planning. Researchers argue that mapping these networks at scale reveals previously invisible infrastructure that supports plant productivity and carbon sequestration, enabling better informed environmental policy. Others caution that translating global patterns into local management practices requires additional field validation. Project leaders argue that a unified dataset allows systematic comparison across regions and improves understanding of how fungal communities respond to environmental change. Former neighbors of Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson alleged she fabricated aspects of her upbringing after reports revealed her family made a 900% profit selling a council house. Phillipson called the coverage a manufactured smear. Critics argue the discrepancy raises questions about the accuracy of public statements on personal background. Supporters maintain that political opponents are selectively highlighting property transactions common among many families. Local records show the sale occurred years ago under standard right-to-buy rules. Questioners contend that consistency between personal narratives and verifiable records matters for public trust, particularly when policies affect housing access. Defenders counter that focusing on one family's financial outcome distracts from broader debates on social mobility and council housing policy. Sarah Cox, who grew up above a Bolton pub, is set to replace Scott Mills on BBC Radio 2. She stated she feels prepared for the role and expects to perform well. BBC management highlighted her long experience and audience connection as reasons for the appointment. Listeners familiar with her earlier shows expressed anticipation for continuity and style. Some industry observers noted the move as part of routine presenter rotation at the station. Supporters argue that promoting established on-air talent maintains listener loyalty and rewards proven performance within the organization. Critics sometimes question whether internal promotions limit opportunities for new voices. Actress Ruthie Henshaw described a 5-year relationship with Prince Edward that included visits to Balmoral and other royal residences. She shared details of private royal life in a new interview. Henshaw presented the account as a personal reflection on a significant period in her life. Royal commentators noted the unusual level of detail about off-duty moments at Balmoral. Some readers viewed the recollections as standard celebrity memoir material. Supporters of such disclosures argue that public figures with ties to the monarchy have a right to share their own experiences when the events are decades old. Traditionalists counter that private royal settings should remain outside public discussion to preserve institutional boundaries. To understand how such calls actually work in diplomacy, most coverage treats high-level conversations as simple exchanges, yet the mechanism involves extensive preparation by national security staffs who draft talking points, anticipate responses, and establish follow-up channels. In practice, such calls allow leaders to test positions without immediate public commitment while creating personal rapport that can later be referenced by negotiators. Knowing this, when you hear claims that a single call resolved or derailed an issue, you can evaluate whether the outcome reflects the conversation itself or the preparatory work and subsequent staff coordination that followed. Next time you see a headline about a leader-to-leader exchange, ask what preparatory documents shaped the agenda, which staff will implement any agreements, and what historical precedents exist for similar direct contacts producing lasting results versus temporary signals. Tomorrow, watch for further statements from NATO members ahead of the Ankara summit. That wraps up today's Omni View. Remember, the best informed people read more than one perspective. If this show helps you do that, share it with someone who values fair coverage. See you tomorrow. And if you'd rather watch than listen, find us on YouTube at NARA Network. Links in the show notes. And before you go, this show is part of the NARA Network, a family of daily podcasts on tech, science, and markets, each one a short, sharp briefing you can finish on the commute. If today earned its place in your feed, here's your next listen. Environmental Intelligence, the Environment and Climate Policy Brief for Canada. Find every show free at naranetwork.com. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.